Battling currents, fending off unknown sea creatures, and enduring a night alone in the Atlantic Ocean are the stuff of nightmares. But that's exactly what happened to one young father when he mysteriously disappeared from a cruise ship in the middle of the night. Hit like and subscribe. This is Fierce. On November 23, 2023, 28-year-old James Michael Grimes stepped on board cruise ship Carnival Valor in New Orleans for a Thanksgiving he would never forget. The ship was bound for Cozumel in Mexico, and James was joined by 17 members of his family. As the ship set sail, they began exploring the decks and the entertainment they had on offer. That evening, they settled in one of the ship's bars. The beer and wine flowed, and James got up on the dance floor to take part in an air guitar competition. James's performance earned him first prize, another drink from the bar, but it was one drink too many. James decided to head to the restroom, but he never made it back to the bar. Instead, he disappeared from the ship. No one saw what happened to him, and James himself cannot remember beyond the air guitar performance. Instead, he woke up in the sea, floating in darkness with no ship in sight. Terrified and confused, James frantically glanced all around him, desperately searching for the cruise ship. He had no recollection of how he ended up in the water, but he was alive, and he knew he had to fight to keep it that way. His greatest fear on earth was of drowning, and now it looked like that fear may become a very real possibility. As daylight broke, the sun cast an orange glow on the horizon. James was thankful of the sunlight and the warmth it brought with it. The sea had sapped the heat from his body during the night, and he was at serious risk of hypothermia. But as the hours ticked by, the sun posed another threat: heat stroke. As the sun beat down, James could feel the skin on his face slowly frying. He dunked his face in the water periodically to cool it down, but soon the salt would be crusted onto his skin, and the burning sensation would return. Back on the ship, nobody even knew he was missing. They assumed he was asleep in his cabin, but when his sister knocked on his door, there was no answer. She opened it and was surprised to find that James wasn't there. After an extensive search around the decks, the family alerted the captain that James was missing. It was a terrifying ordeal. The Coast Guard was notified, and they immediately scrambled to the open waters of the Gulf of Mexico. The cruise ship itself circled the area, but no trace of James could be found. He was just a microscopic dot in the vastness of the Atlantic. Back in the water, James was battling. He decided then and there that he wouldn't give up. No matter how long he was in the water for, no matter how exhausted he would keep going. But getting out of that situation may have just been a fairy tale, as James suddenly spotted a terrifying sight. Although drowning was his biggest fear, there was something else that sent shudders down the spines of even the bravest of souls. The thought enters our minds when we step into the ocean, when we step into their domain. It is, of course, sharks. At that moment, James spotted the bone-chilling sight of a dark gray dorsal fin slicing through the surface of the sea. It was heading directly for him. A small bow wave in front of the creature was just yards from him. He instinctively ducked his head under the water to see what was coming, but it was blurry without a mask on. He couldn't see anything except for an ominous shadow coming for him. A second later, the creature brushed past his legs, and James kicked out with all his strength. He struck the animal, and it veered away. James wheeled around to see where it went. He couldn't see it anymore. He couldn't see the dorsal fin. Was it circling him below? Was it coming back for more? James's heart was thumping louder than it had ever done before. It was thundering in his ears as he scoured the sea all around him, looking for the tip of a dorsal fin or the open jaws of an enormous shark appearing right beside him. But it never happened. Only after some considerable time did James stop panicking about being eaten alive by a shark. Whatever it had been, it was now gone, and James was all alone once more. He rested his head back, starting up at the cloudless sky. He squinted against the sun and closed his eyes. He began to sing to himself, making up songs and imaging seeing his little girl again. But as the hours ticked by, that seemed less and less likely. There was only so long a man could tread water for in shark-infested seas without a buoyancy aid or any means of communication. But as James was approaching his 20th hour in the water, he spotted something. There was something on the horizon. Shielding his eyes against the glare of the sun, James could just make out the distant outline of a ship, and then another one. It must be a shipping lane ahead of him. He decided to make a go of it. If he could get close enough to the shipping lane, then surely someone would see him in the water. So, James began the long, grueling, and arduous swim towards the distant shipping lane. He paused every so often to assess his progress. It was impossible to tell. As the minutes turned into hours, it didn't feel like he was getting any closer. He could be swimming against a current and not know about it. He could literally be staying in the same spot despite expending all this energy. But he didn't have a choice. He had to try. After a couple of hours of propelling himself through the water, the ships looked clearer. They looked closer. This gave James hope. He must be making progress. But the light was fading rapidly. James knew that it was now or never. He didn't think that he could survive another night at sea. He was utterly exhausted, and the chill as the sun began dropping in the sky told him that he would be in for a freezing cold night. He kept going. Then he made it relatively close to one of the ships. Now, all he had to do was get their attention. He knew nobody could hear him, but it was instinct to shout for help. He waved his hands above his head and made as much splashing as possible, but who would see him? A tiny dot far below the deck of the ship. It was almost impossible to distinguish him from any other patch of ocean. And yet, somehow, someone on board the ship noticed him. They could see a tiny figure waving its arms around frantically in the water below. James looked up at them, praying that they had seen him. And they had. They threw him a buoyancy aid with a flashlight on it, and James made a dash for it. But the waves were picking up. The surface of the sea was getting choppy, and the buoyancy aid was being pulled away from him in a different direction. James had to conserve his energy. So, instead of chasing after the buoyancy aid, he decided to focus on treading water as he had done so for the past 20 hours. Then he got the news he had been waiting for. Over the loudspeaker, he heard the ship's captain tell him that the Coast Guard were 15 minutes away. He just had to hold on for a little bit longer. As dusk began setting in, James heard a familiar sound. It was a distant rumble, and it grew louder. A moment later, he realized that it was the whirring of a helicopter. The Coast Guard was there, and the chopper began circling the ship. James was waving madly, but it seemed the crew hadn't seen him. Then finally, it hovered above James's position. He looked up, a wave of relief washing over him, and watched as a rescue swimmer dropped into the water. That swimmer was Richard Dickey Hofley, who estimated that James had about 90 seconds left before he was lost to the waves. He said that some people are emotional when they are rescued, others break down and cry, and others are elated. But James literally had no energy to react at all. He was completely exhausted. James's first comment to the rescue swimmer was that he didn't have any clothes on because he had stripped off to attract their attention. Then he felt an overwhelming feeling of gratitude when he was winched up to the helicopter in the basket. James was rushed to hospital in New Orleans, where he spent 5 days in the ICU recovering from his ordeal. He was treated for hypothermia and dehydration. He truly believes that God was with him out there, keeping him afloat. It was a true miracle that he was spotted by the passing ship, and that he managed to keep his head above water for almost 20 hours.